We once saved Earth, now it's humanity's turn to save the galaxy. They told us the war was already over. Not because we had won. Not because the enemy had surrendered. But because the Galactic Strategic Command had run the numbers, trajectory models, resource projections, probability matrices, and the numbers said that the outer systems were gone. Statistically. Mathematically. With the cold, irrefutable certainty that 600 years of unified galactic science could produce. The Vothrani cascade was consuming star systems at a rate of 1 every 43 rotations. It didn't negotiate. It didn't slow. It didn't respond to weapons, to diplomacy, to the 17 evacuation protocols the Council had drafted and abandoned. It simply moved, the way glaciers move, without malice, without intelligence, and without any interest in what was in its path. I was the one who wrote the final assessment. Senior Field Analyst Seth Vara of the Karathi Observation Corps, 3rd Caste, 11 years of service, and the dubious honor of being the most accurate predictor of catastrophic failure in the entire Eastern Fleet. My commanding officers called it a gift. I called it pattern recognition. The patterns, lately, had all been pointing in the same direction. Down. I submitted my report. I watched the Council accept it. I began quietly drafting transfer requests to systems that still had a 20-year window. Then, someone let the humans read it. I want to be precise about what happened next, because in the cycle since, the story has been retold so many times and, in so many ways that the actual sequence of events has been buried under legend, propaganda, and what I can only describe as deliberate mythologization by people who were not there. What happened next was not heroic. It was not clean. It was not the kind of thing you put in a recruitment hologram or carve into a memorial plaza. It was loud. It smelled like burnt metal and something the humans called coffee that I still cannot think about without my secondary palate sealing. It involved more shouting than any coordinated military operation should functionally require. It resulted in the destruction of 3 of our own staging platforms, 1 diplomatic shuttle, and a catering vessel that had simply been docked in the wrong place. And it worked. That is the part one have never been able to explain to my own people. Not the tactics, I can diagram those. Not the physics, I understand the mechanics well enough. What I cannot explain, what I have spent 11 years since that day failing to translate into any language the Karathi have words for, is this: the humans read my report, which concluded with mathematical certainty that the outer systems were lost, and their first, unanimous, collective response was not grief. It was not acceptance. It was not the orderly, rational, species-preserving withdrawal that every survival model in galactic history has ever recommended. It was a sergeant named Reeves looking up from the data tablet, chewing something that may or may not have been food, and saying, "Yeah, but have we tried being really annoying about it?" I did not understand that sentence for approximately 6 hours. By the end of those 6 hours, I was beginning to. By the end of the campaign, I had stopped trying to understand it at all. Some things, I have learned, are not meant to be understood. They are only meant to be witnessed. This is what I witnessed. Part 1, the numbers don't lie, but they don't know Reeves. The Vothrani cascade did not look like death. That was the first thing that confounded the observation teams when the early survey drones returned their data. Everyone had expected something visually violent, something the threat assessment models would flag in urgent red, something that looked like the end of things. Instead, the initial imagery showed a slow, almost beautiful distortion, a shimmering expansion front where the laws governing stellar plasma cohesion simply stopped applying, where suns stretched and elongated and came apart like something pulled apart by patient hands. It was, in the words of one of our junior analysts, Ven A.K., who has since transferred to a very quiet research post far from anything important, the most serene catastrophe in recorded galactic history. The Vothrani cascade did not care what it looked like. It had already consumed the Pulhari cluster, the 3 inhabited systems of the Yennik belt, and was currently processing the outer rim of the Drethian expanse at a rate that my models updated every 14 hours and that my models, every 14 hours, made slightly worse. I was on the command platform of the Karathi observation vessel Seth Marin, named for my own ancestral lineage, which I had once considered an honor and now considered an omen when the human delegation came aboard. This was not, to be precise, a delegation in any formal sense. The The Council had authorized a joint species tactical review, which in practice meant that 12 humans arrived via a docking shuttle that was held together, as near as I could determine, by welding scars and what one of the human engineers described to me as prayer and stubbornness, mostly the second one. I was standing at the primary observation window, running my update calculations, when they filed through the docking ring. I did not look up immediately. I was working. There was a variance in the Cascade's expansion coefficient that I wanted to account for before the briefing, a small anomaly that was almost certainly irrelevant but that my pattern recognition instincts, the instincts my commanding officers called a gift and I called a chronic inability to leave well enough alone, refused to let me ignore. The anomaly was a 0.003% deviation in the Cascade's lateral propagation rate in Sector 7. Probably atmospheric interference from the last consumed system. Probably nothing. I noted it. Filed it. Looked up. The human called Reeves was staring directly at me. Karathi do not have facial expressions in the way most galactic species do. Our emotional displays are primarily olfactory and chromatophoric, patterning across the dorsal ridge scales in colors that the diplomatic manuals describe as subtle and that my third-caste colleagues describe, with less diplomacy, as impossible for warm-blooded species to read. I was, at that moment, displaying a color pattern that in my culture would have communicated mild professional interest with undertones of scheduling stress. Reeves apparently read something else entirely, because she tilted her head and said, "You look like you're about to deliver bad news." I was. "Yes," I said. "That is accurate." She nodded, the way humans nod, a motion I had studied in behavioral briefings and still found slightly unsettling, as it involves the voluntary movement of a structure that, in Karathi anatomy, does not move voluntarily. "Great," she said. "Love bad news. Gets the blood moving." She found a seat at the briefing table and began doing something to the sleeve of her uniform jacket, a small repetitive motion with her fingers that I initially catalogued as a nervous habit before I realized she was actually repairing a torn seam. With a needle. While waiting for a briefing about the potential extinction of multiple inhabited systems. I noted this. Filed it under anomalous behavior, subcategory, significance unclear. I would fill that subcategory many times in the days ahead. The briefing itself I have delivered so many times since that the words have worn grooves into my memory. I know exactly where the silences fall, where the other Karathi analysts shift in their seats, where the holographic display of the Cascade expansion front produces a sound from the assembled audience that is not quite a gasp and is not quite silence but is somewhere in the register between them. I know where my own voice tightens slightly, a thing I cannot control and that only registers on close audio analysis, but that is there, in the recordings, for anyone who wants to find it. The outer systems were gone. Statistical certainty. The Cascade's expansion rate had no precedent in known galactic history and no theoretical upper limit. Current projections placed inhabited systems in the secondary wave at risk within 600 rotations. Current projections for the tertiary wave, which included Council core systems, were between 1,200 and 1,400 rotations, depending on variables that the models could not confidently pin down. We had 600 rotations to do something about it. The working assumption of every tactical model we had built was that there was nothing to do. The Cascade was not a weapon. It was not an invasion fleet. It could not be destroyed because it was not, technically, a thing. It was a condition, a spreading failure of physical law, and you cannot shoot a law. You cannot outmaneuver entropy. The only functional response was managed retreat, coordinate evacuation of the secondary systems, establish new habitation zones in the deep core, and accept the mathematics. The Karathi Strategic Council had accepted the mathematics. The Pulhari Remnant Fleet had accepted the mathematics. The Yenik Collective, the Drethian Consensus, and 7 other species whose homeworlds were now shimmering distortions in the Cascade's wake had all accepted the mathematics, some of them more gracefully than others. I finished the briefing. I pulled up the final slide, the probability matrix, the migration corridors, the projected timeline for controlled withdrawal, and I waited. The other Karathi officers were silent in the way that means, we knew this already, and hearing it again has not made it easier. The human delegation was silent too. Then, Reeves, who had finished repairing her sleeve and was now, inexplicably, writing something on a physical piece of paper with a physical pen, a technology that the Karathi had not used in 4,000 years and whose presence in an active military briefing I found profoundly disorienting, said, without looking up from her paper, "What's in Sector 7? The room went very still. I turned. "I'm sorry? Sector 7. She tapped the holographic display with the pen, actually made contact with the holographic surface, which registered nothing, because it was light, but the gesture was somehow entirely clear. "You've got a deviation flag on the expansion rate. Small. I almost missed it. What's there?" My dorsal scales shifted through a color sequence that the diplomatic manuals would have described as professional reassessment and that my colleagues would have described as, she read my variance note. In a briefing I had just spent 47 minutes delivering. "The Polhari Cascade Relay Station," I said. "Or what remains of it. The cascade consumed the primary structure 14 rotations ago. The debris field is still there," Reeves said. She looked up from her paper. Her eyes, in the pale artificial light of the observation deck, were a shade of brown that registered in my visual spectrum as unremarkable, and, in some frequency I did not have a clean name for, as extremely focused. "The debris field is still there, inside the cascade boundary." "Yes. The expansion front passed through it rather than consuming it," she said. "Why?" I had asked myself this question. The anomaly. The 0.003% deviation. I had filed it under probably atmospheric interference, significance unclear, and moved on because the briefing needed finishing and the mathematics needed presenting and the probability matrix was already built. I had not, until this moment, followed the question to its end. "We don't know," I said. Reeves wrote something on her paper. She wrote for what felt like a very long time relative to the information available. Then, she put the pen down, looked at the holographic cascade display, the slow, beautiful, catastrophic spread of it, all the light-colored terror of the end of things, and said, "We should probably find out." Beside her, a human named Maddox, who had been so quiet throughout the briefing that I had almost forgotten he was in the room, leaned forward and said, "She's already got a theory. She just wants to see if you'll get there yourself." Reeves did not look at him. "That's rude," she said. "Yeah," he said, and seemed entirely unbothered by this. I looked between them. I looked at the deviation in Sector 7. I looked at the debris field of the Polhari Cascade Relay Station, which had been consumed by an expansion event that had destroyed everything around it and had, for reasons my models had categorized as atmospheric interference, left a field of wreckage intact inside the cascade boundary. The relay station had been built to manage quantum entanglement coherence across the Polhari cluster. Its primary function had been maintaining synchronized probability fields across 37 inhabited systems, an engineering achievement that the Karathi had studied and considered extraordinary and that the Polhari themselves had considered, apparently, simply adequate. The debris field was intact. Inside the cascade. Where nothing else was intact. I stood at the holographic display for a time I am not going to specify in this record because it is embarrassing in retrospect. My dorsal scales were doing something I had no clean cultural vocabulary for. Then, I said, with a precision that I now recognize as the sound of a mind that has just been handed something it does not know what to do with, the quantum coherence field. "There you go," said Reeves, and picked up her pen again. What followed was 14 hours of the most fractious, disorganized, productive analysis I have conducted in 11 years of service. The human delegation did not work the way Karathi analysts work, which is to say, they did not work in orderly sequential steps, building from established principles, verifying each component before moving to the next. They worked the way, I would learn over the coming rotations, humans apparently work through everything, simultaneously, loudly, with multiple contradictory hypotheses running in parallel, with frequent breaks for the consumption of foods and liquids that had no business being in a working analytical environment, with a great deal of what sounded like arguing and that Maddox, when I asked him about it, described as thinking out loud, "We just do it at each other." The theory that emerged, which I have since had time to formalize, to test, to verify against 14 separate datasets, and to publish under a title considerably more dignified than its working name, which was Reeves's suggestion and which was, verbatim, What if we fight the void with math? Was this the Bothrani cascade propagated by destabilizing the quantum probability fields that underlie stable matter cohesion? It spread the way certain information-based diseases spread, by converting structured quantum states into chaotic ones, using the destabilized matter as a propagation medium. The Pulhari relay station's debris field had survived not despite being inside the cascade boundary but because of what it was, a coherence field generator, which had, even in its destroyed state, been broadcasting a low-level quantum stabilization signal that the cascade propagation wave could not use as a medium. The cascade could not eat what was already organized. The cascade could not propagate through matter that was already coherent. There was a word in the Karathi analytical lexicon Sethran that meant the specific intellectual discomfort of a simple solution appearing after years of complex failure. Every analyst knew the word. I had used it in reports 3 times in my career, always in retrospect, always describing a moment I had not been present for. I was present for this one. So we built coherence generators, said the human named Volkov, who had said almost nothing for the first 10 hours and who had now, apparently, decided to say the thing everyone was thinking. He was a large man in a uniform that had clearly been repaired more often than it had been replaced, and he was holding the kind of cup that humans apparently carry everywhere, the one that contains the coffee, the smell of which had been contributing to my secondary palate's distress since approximately hour 2. Big ones. Enough to push back against the expansion front. The energy requirements, I said, because I had already run this calculation and the number was not small, would exceed the combined output of every active energy generation system in the Council's fleet. By a factor of approximately 9. Right, said Volkov, and took a drink of the coffee, and seemed not to find the factor of 9 problem particularly discouraging. That's a lot, said another human, Ferreira, who had been building something on the briefing table out of the leftover components of a disassembled data terminal for the past 3 hours and who had not, until this moment, appeared to be listening to the conversation at all. She held up what she had built, which was a small, dense, unmistakably deliberate piece of engineering that bore no resemblance to any configuration I had seen before. What if we don't try to push against the whole front? What if we just punch a hole in it? A corridor. Stable matter corridor, maintained by relay generators. Not stopping the cascade. Just making a seam it can't cross. The room was quiet. Ferreira looked at the device in her hands, looked at the display, and said, with the particular tone of someone who has already worked out 3 more steps but is waiting to see if everyone else catches up, like stitching. You're not stopping the tear. You're keeping it from spreading. I looked at the display. I looked at the Sector 7 deviation, at the Pulhari debris field, at the intact structure of the quantum coherence zone inside a boundary that had eaten everything around it. I looked at Ferreira's improvised device, which she had built from a disassembled terminal during a briefing about the potential extinction of civilizations, because apparently that was simply what she did with her hands when she was thinking. My secondary palate was still in distress from the coffee. The briefing room smelled of humans, warm, complex, faintly chemical in ways my olfactory catalog kept trying to classify and kept failing. Someone had, at some point in the last 3 hours, found food and placed it on the corner of the briefing table, and 2 of the human delegates were eating it, and one of them was Reeves, who was simultaneously eating and annotating my probability matrix with a pen that she appeared to have produced from somewhere within her uniform jacket, adding notes in the margin in a script I would later learn was not standard but was some secondary human language she apparently defaulted to. When thinking fast. I have kept that document. The annotated probability matrix, with the marginal notes in Reeves's secondary language, 3 of which I later had translated and 2 of which were analytical observations of genuine value and 1 of which was, near as the translator could determine, a short and mildly profane poem about doing mathematics under pressure. I have not thrown it away. I do not entirely know why. The cascade deviation in Sector 7 was 0.003%. An anomaly so small that my own models had flagged it and moved on. An anomaly that, in 14 hours, had become the theoretical basis for the only functional counter-strategy in 600 rotations of cascade expansion. I updated my probability matrix that night. Not the evacuation corridors. Not the migration timelines. For the first time in 11 years of pattern recognition, I opened a field I had never populated before, a category I had built into the model as a formality because it was required by standard template and that I had never had cause to use. I labeled it Alternative Outcomes. I put a number in it. The number was not 0. I sat with that for a while. Outside the viewport, the stars were where they had always been, and the cascade was where it had been yesterday, spreading slow and beautiful and terrible, and the Seth Marin hummed around me with the sounds of its systems and its crew, and somewhere in the corridor outside the briefing room, Reeves was telling Maddox something that made him laugh, a short, involuntary sound that the Korathi behavioral manuals describe as a vocalization of unexpected positive cognitive association, and that I was beginning to suspect the behavioral manuals were describing incorrectly. It was not a small sound, that laugh. It bounced off the corridor walls and came in through the briefing room door and found me sitting at the probability matrix with a non-zero number in the field labeled Alternative Outcomes. I noted it. This time, I did not file it under Anomalous Behavior, Subcategory, Significance Unclear. I left the subcategory blank. Some things, I was already beginning to learn, did not fit neatly into any category I had. The theory was sound. The mathematics were survivable. The energy requirements were catastrophic and the engineering timeline was aggressive, and the probability of successful implementation, according to my revised models, was somewhere between 12 and 31%, depending on assumptions I was not yet confident making. 12 to 31%. 600 rotations ago, the field had read 0. Reeves had found a 0.003% deviation in a briefing she was attending for the first time, in a dataset she had no prior familiarity with, while simultaneously repairing a torn seam in her jacket with a needle and thread. I thought about this for a long time that night, in the way that Korathi analysts think, systematically, precisely, building from known principles toward a conclusion, and I reached a conclusion that my known principles had not prepared me for, and that I was not sure the Korathi analytical lexicon had a word for. I think the word I was looking for might have been hope. Not the rational allocation of probability to favorable outcomes. Not the calculated assessment of viable alternatives. Not the ordered, Sethran clarity of a simple solution revealed after complex failure. Something less precise than any of those. Something that, when I searched the analytical lexicon, returned no results. Humans, I would later learn, had 17 words for variations of the concept. None of them, as near as I could tell, involved a mathematical model. I started a new document that night. Not an analysis. Not a report. Something I had not written in a very long time. At the top, I wrote, things that do not fit. And then, I went to sleep, and, in the morning, we began to build. Part 2, the stitching the coherence relay network was, by any reasonable engineering standard, impossible. I want to be specific about what I mean by that, because impossible is a word that gets used imprecisely in crisis contexts, deployed whenever something seems very difficult or very expensive or very unlikely, stripped of its actual meaning through overuse until it becomes more emotional than technical. When I say the coherence relay network was, by any reasonable engineering standard, impossible, I mean that I spent 16 hours with 6 of the best structural physicists in the Korathi fleet running formal possibility assessments, and what we produced was a document that used the word impossible in 11 separate technical contexts, 5 of which were distinct definitions of the term, and that concluded, unanimously, with full supporting data, that the coherence relay network could not be built in the available time with the available resources without violating several principles that our models treated as inviolable. Reeves read the assessment over my shoulder while I was writing the summary. She said. That was all. One syllable. The sound a person makes when they have heard something and noted it and are already thinking about something else. I turned to look at her. The assessment concludes that the network, I read it, she said. The timeline alone requires, I know. The relay fabrication process has never been attempted at this Sephara. She said my name, my full name, which she had asked me to spell phonetically on the second day and which she had been pronouncing correctly since the third, which no non-Korathi had ever managed before the 6th day at the earliest, and she said it with the specific inflection that I had learned meant, I understand what you're telling me, and I'm telling you it doesn't change what we're doing. We're going to build it anyway. The probability of success within the projected timeline is I know what the probability is. She was looking at the structural schematic on the display, the relay network projected across the cascade boundary and the tidy conceptual lines of a model that had never had to survive contact with an actual expansion front. I've been looking at it all morning. The probability is low. It's also not zero. She tapped the display. Where do we lose the most time? What's the single longest process in the construction sequence? I looked at the timeline. I had built the timeline. I knew exactly where we lost the time. The quantum resonance calibration of each relay node, I said. It requires a minimum of 42 hours per node to establish stable coherence parameters. We need 317 nodes to form a complete network seam across the cascade front. The calibration process can it be run in parallel? I had not asked this question. The calibration process was a sequential procedure, step 1, step 2, step 3, in order, non-negotiable, and the idea of running it in parallel had not, in 16 hours of engineering assessment with 6 structural physicists, come up. I ran the numbers. Not the formal assessment. The quick numbers, the back of the page calculation, the kind of preliminary check you run before you know whether it's worth running properly. Technically, quantum resonance calibration could not be run in parallel using standard Karathi relay fabrication protocols. The protocols had been designed around the assumption that calibration was a sequential process because it had always been a sequential process, because no one had ever needed to calibrate 317 relay nodes simultaneously, because no one had ever needed to build a quantum coherence network large enough to contain a galactic-scale expansion event. The protocols assumed the old problem. We had a new problem. The standard protocols do not allow for parallel calibration, I said. Right, said Reeves. What if we don't use the standard protocols? The structural physicist nearest to us, a Karathi named Vinay, who had co-authored the assessment and, who had used impossible in 3 of its 11 technical contexts, made a sound that translated approximately as, that question is technically imprecise and, also giving me anxiety. Reeves looked at Vinay. Sorry, she said, with the particular tone that I was learning meant she was not actually sorry but recognized that an apology was socially expected. I'm just asking, is there a way to run the calibration across multiple nodes simultaneously if we accept a lower initial precision threshold and correct for variance during the first operational cycle? Vinay was quiet for a moment. Reeves waited. She was, I had noticed, extremely good at waiting. Humans in tactical media are generally depicted as impatient, aggressive, kinetic, always moving, always pushing, always the first to act. Reeves was not that. She could sit with a silence the way a deep-water organism sits in pressure, not fighting it, not needing it to resolve, just existing in it until it told her something. The variance during the first operational cycle would be significant, Vinay said, in the tone of someone who was answering a question they had not considered and who does not yet know what the answer means. How significant? Unknown. No one has, this has never been, Vinay paused. Used the word impossible silently, in a 6th technical context, in the privacy of its own mind. The first cycle would be unstable. The coherence field would be unreliable. The network would be operational but inconsistent. But operational, Reeves said. Technically. Okay. She turned back to the schematic. Build it unstable. We'll stabilize it while it's running. Vinay's dorsal scales performed a color sequence that the diplomatic manuals would have described as analytical distress. I recognized the pattern. I had been displaying variations of it continuously since the second day of the human delegation's presence aboard the Seth Marin. I had begun to think of it as a kind of calibration in itself. My scales changed color when my models stopped working. The more often my models stopped working, the more often my scales changed color. The more often my scales changed color, the better I was apparently doing at something I did not yet have a name for. The construction began 6 days after the briefing. I will not catalog the full engineering sequence here. That account exists in the formal technical record, written in the precise Karathi style that my analytical training required, and it is a document that does not capture, in any way that I find satisfying, what the construction actually was. What it felt like from the inside. What it looked like through the viewport of the Seth Marin's secondary observation deck at third cycle, fourth cycle, the hours when the artificial lighting had dropped to its night setting and the only illumination was the cold blue of work drones and the warm orange-yellow of human cutting torches and the shimmering, distant, terrible light of the Cascade expansion front, always moving, always a little closer. What the construction was, from the inside, was this: it was too many people in too few spaces doing things that had never been done before, making mistakes at a rate that my error tracking logs documented with increasing alarm, correcting those mistakes at a rate that my models were not calibrated to predict, and moving faster than any Karathi engineering project I had ever been part of, not because the individual steps were faster but because the gaps between steps, the planning pauses, the verification delays, the protocol reviews, were simply not there. Reeves was everywhere. Not in the way that a commanding officer is everywhere, not directing, not supervising, not issuing orders through a communication relay from a position of appropriate oversight. Physically everywhere. I saw her in the fabrication bay running calibration checks at second cycle and, then, on the drone deployment deck at fourth cycle and, then, bafflingly, in the Seth Marin's secondary engine compartment, which was nowhere near the relay construction end, which she apparently visited because she wanted to understand how the ship's own quantum coherence systems worked and, because, in her words, if I'm going to mess with the architecture of physical law I should probably know what we're doing to the ship while we do it. This was not part of her assigned role. Her assigned role was tactical coordination. I noted this. This time I did not file it anywhere. The relay nodes went up in staggered clusters, deployed by drone teams working in overlapping shifts, anchored to the debris field of the Pulhare Cascade Relay Station, which had, somewhat poetically, become the foundation of its own successor. The coherence field began building between nodes before the full network was complete, irregular and patchy and nothing like the clean theoretical model in the schematic, but there, present, measurable, a thing that had not existed 12 days ago and that was now, despite my assessment and Venneke's assessment and the combined formal conclusions of 6 structural physicists, real. Maddox, who had said almost nothing since the first briefing, came to stand beside me at the secondary observation viewport on the 14th day of construction and looked at the partial network without speaking for a while. He had a cup of the coffee. He had brought a second cup, which he placed on the viewport ledge between us without comment or explanation. I looked at the second cup. I know you don't drink it, he said, still looking at the network. I'm not offering it to you. I just think better when there's 2 cups. I looked at the second cup for a longer time than was probably necessary. Then, I looked back at the network. The calibration variance in nodes 14 through 31 is higher than the acceptable operating threshold, I said. Reeves knows, he said. The first operational cycle will be unstable. The coherence field in those nodes will be, she knows. He took a drink of his coffee. He had the same quality of patience that Reeves had, but different in texture. Where her patience was active, something she chose, his felt more like weather. Like a landscape feature. She ran the variance numbers herself last night. She's going to correct it manually during deployment. I turned to look at him. Manually. She's going to be inside the network during the first operational cycle, he said, in the tone of someone explaining something that he has already argued about and accepted and is no longer arguing about. In an EVA suit. With a portable calibration rig. Correcting the variance nodes as the field activates around her. I stood with this information for a moment. Outside the viewport, a drone team was anchoring node 47 to the debris field, and the partial coherence field between nodes was doing something that my instruments read as technically encouraging and that my eyes read as beautiful in a way I had no analytical category for: a shimmer, a coherence, a kind of visible order against the slow beautiful chaos of the cascade beyond. The first operational cycle will be dangerous, I said. Yes, Maddox agreed. The coherence field will be unstable. The suit's own, yes. If the field destabilizes in the section she's, yes. He looked at me, for the first time since he'd come to the viewport. His expression was one I had been cataloging since the humans came aboard, a particular human expression that my behavioral database had entries for and that those entries consistently failed to translate properly. It was the expression of someone who has been afraid for a long time and has stopped fighting the fear and is simply carrying it now, the way you carry something heavy on a long walk. She knows, he said. She's going to do it anyway. I looked at the second cup of coffee on the viewport ledge. It was cooling. The steam was no longer visible. In the recycled air of the observation deck, it would be room temperature within a few minutes, and room temperature, according to every human I had spoken to about the subject, was not how coffee was supposed to be consumed. It was going to cool whether he watched it or not. He had brought it anyway. The construction completed on the 19th day. 317 nodes, spanning the primary expansion front of the Vothrani Cascade in a corridor 6,000 kilometers wide, not a wall, not a barrier, not the kind of bold geometry that the schematic had shown, but a seam, a stitch, irregular end, patchy end, built from debris and improvisation end, the repurposed architecture of a station that had already been destroyed by the thing we were trying to stop. The calibration variance in nodes 14 through 31 was within the operational threshold for 21 of those nodes. For the remaining 10, the variance was not within the threshold. The field would activate. The coherence corridor would exist. Those 10 nodes would either correct themselves during the first operational cycle, which was theoretically possible and practically unlikely, or they would destabilize, and the corridor would tear in the section they anchored, and the cascade would expand through the gap, and we would be back to the probability matrix. That was the situation on the morning of the 20th day, when Reeves suited up. I was in the primary observation bay. I was, at that point, supposed to be running the activation sequence, my role in the operation, the role I had been assigned, the role that kept me at a console with my instruments and my data feeds and my scales doing whatever they were going to do in the privacy of the observation bay where no one except Maddox, who was standing 2 meters to my left and holding a cup of coffee he was not drinking, would see them. I watched Reeves's suit beacon track through the network on my display. She was moving to node 17 first, the worst of the 10 variance nodes, the one where the calibration deviation was large enough that my models flagged it as likely to cascade fail before she could correct it. She was moving to the worst one first. I spent approximately 12 seconds trying to construct an analytical explanation for this sequencing decision. Then, I stopped. Her suit beacon held at node 17. The network activation sequence was counting down on my secondary display. The cascade expansion front was on my primary display, steady and slow and patient, as it had always been. 30 seconds to activation. The recycled air of the observation bay smelled of coolant and, faintly, of Maddox's coffee. The ship hummed. The drone teams had cleared the network perimeter. The beacon at node 17 was perfectly still. 20 seconds. I was aware, at that moment, of the second cup of coffee from the previous night that I had not drunk and that Maddox had not drunk and that had been room temperature by the time either of us left the observation deck. I was aware that I had carried the cup to the disposal unit myself, rather than leaving it for the maintenance drones, because by the time I was ready to leave, Maddox had already gone and the cup was there and it seemed wrong to leave it. This was not a rational thought. It was not analytical. It had no bearing on the activation sequence or the calibration variance or the probability matrix. I noted it. 10 seconds. The network activated. The coherence field expanded across the 317 nodes in a cascade, different kind of cascade, ordered cascade, the kind that builds rather than consumes, and, on my display I watched the field form, watched the corridor stabilize in the nodes where the calibration was clean, watched the variance nodes flicker and struggle and begin the process of either correcting or failing, and, at node 17, where the deviation had been large enough that my models flagged it as likely to cascade fail before manual correction, the beacon moved. Reeves moved. She was inside an activating quantum coherence field, in an EVA suit with a portable calibration rig, correcting variance in real time, and, on my display her suit beacon moved from 17 to 18 to 19 with a precision that had no right to exist inside an unstable coherence field, and, each node her beacon touched stopped flickering on my display, went from variance red to stable green, one after another, and, the corridor was building around her, the stitching holding, the seam not tearing, and the cascade beyond the network boundary continued its expansion and, then, at node 21, the boundary held. The cascade front reached the coherence corridor, and the corridor was there, and the boundary held. It was not dramatic. On my display, it looked like a line. A line that had not been there before, and was there now, and that the cascade expansion data was registering as a boundary it could not cross. A line. I was looking at the display when Maddox said, very quietly, "There she is." Reeves's suit beacon was moving back toward the Seth Marin's docking bay, smooth and unhurried, and, on the communication channel I heard her voice, slightly out of breath, entirely calm, saying to the suit telemetry system, "Nodes 14 through 23, calibrated. Running a check on the tertiary anchor points. Going to need someone to look at the resonance coupling on node 9 when I'm back in its holding, but I don't like the harmonics." That was all. A maintenance note. A task for later. Behind her, the coherence corridor shimmered against the cascade front, holding, and the expansion data was showing a propagation rate that was. I ran the calculation twice because the first result seemed wrong. 0. In the corridor section. 0. Not reduced. Not slowed. 0. I stood at my console for a long time. My dorsal scales were doing something. I have reviewed the observation bay recordings and I can confirm that they were doing something I do not have a cultural term for, a color and pattern combination that does not appear in the Karathi chromatophoric behavioral index and that I have since spent some time trying to describe, and, that is, near as I can get, the color of a calculation that came out differently than every model predicted, and the feeling that this is not a failure of the models but a failure of everything the models were built on, and something else underneath that, quieter, that I still do not have a word for. Maddox drank his coffee. It had been room temperature for at least 10 minutes. "She's going to say the node 9 harmonics were her own fault," he said, to no one in particular. "She adjusted the resonance coupling herself during the final pre-activation check. She always does that, finds something small to fix, then forgets she fixed it and worries about it anyway." He sounded fond. I noted this. I did not file it anywhere. The corridor held through the rest of that cycle and the next. The cascade did not cross the boundary in the section we had built. Elsewhere, along the unprotected front, it continued as it had always continued, patient, beautiful, terrible, but, in our section, in the 6,000 kilometers seemed stitched together from debris and improvisation and a calibration deviation that a briefing I had almost not finished had almost missed, the boundary held. The formal assessment I filed that evening was precise, thorough, and technically accurate in every particular. It documented the construction timeline, the calibration variance, the activation parameters, the initial stability readings. It cited the theoretical basis correctly. It attributed credit accurately. At the bottom, in the section reserved for analysts' observations, a section I had used, in 11 years, to note weather patterns, equipment performance variance, and, once, memorably, a complaint about the calibration drone scheduling system, I wrote, "The corridor is holding." The models did not predict this. The models were not wrong. The models were built for a different problem. I paused. Then, I added, "We are apparently solving a different problem now." Outside the viewport, node 17 of the coherence relay network shimmered in the dark. Reeves would be in the debrief by now, telling someone about the node 9 harmonics. The night cycle deepened. The cascade held its position on the far side of our line. I opened the document I had started the first night. Things that do not fit. I wrote for a long time. Part 3, the thing we carry forward. The corridor held for 47 days before the cascade found a seam. I want to be honest about this because the account that circulates in the Council archives describes the Pulhari corridor as a clean engineering success, a tactical victory with clear before and after lines, the kind of story that reduces well to memorial plaques and mission summaries. I was there. It was not clean. The cascade found the weak point in the tertiary anchor section, node 9, with its harmonic irregularity that Reeves had worried about and that we had patched, and that had, under 47 days of sustained boundary pressure, developed a stress fracture in the resonance coupling that the patch was not designed to survive. The fracture propagated in under 3 hours on the 48th day. My monitoring systems flagged it at the second hour. By the time I had assembled the situation data and was preparing a formal alert to the command channel, Reeves was already in a suit. I did not ask how she had known. I had stopped asking those questions around day 11. She had a sense for the network the way I searched my behavioral database, found nothing useful, searched my own experience instead, the way certain Karathi navigators develop a sense for deep space current flows. Not instrumented. Not analytical. Pattern recognition of a different kind than mine, running in the background of everything she did, surfacing when something changed. The fracture was in the tertiary anchor section, which meant it was at the edge of the coherence corridor, which meant that if the anchor failed, the corridor would not collapse entirely, it would compress, narrow from 6,000 kilometers to something smaller, and the cascade would push through the gap at the edges, and we would lose ground, and the probability matrix would update. The probability matrix, at that point, was sitting at 64% favorable, meaning that if the full network held, if the anchor extension plan that Ferreira had drafted went into effect on schedule, if the 3 additional species that had committed resources to the expansion project delivered those resources on the projected timeline, we had a 64% chance of containing the cascade front entirely within the next 200 rotations. 64%. I had not seen a number like that in this column of my matrix in 11 years. If the anchor failed, the probability revised downward. My models gave me 17 as the revised figure, which was better than 0 and worse than 64 and which was the number I was looking at when Reeves's suit beacon appeared on my display, moving through the network toward node 9. Maddox was not in the observation bay this time. He was in the secondary hull with a team of construction drones, working on the anchor extension framework that Ferreira had designed and that needed to go up before the coupling stress became unmanageable. I had a communication channel open to his team. I could hear the sounds of cutting tools and the particular cadence of humans working under pressure, short communications, no wasted syllables, the same compressed efficiency I had observed on the first day but that I could read now, that I had learned to parse, that my pattern recognition had finally built a model for even if I still did not have the right words. Reeves reached node 9. I watched her beacon hold there, the way it had held at node 17 on the first activation day, perfectly still in a place that was not safe to be still. Talk to me on 9, she said. On the calm resonance coupling stress is at 140% of rated threshold, I said. I was already running the containment calculation. Already building the updated intervention sequence. Already, without deciding to, doing the thing she needed from me before she asked for it. The fracture is propagating toward the anchor mount. If it reaches the mount before the coupling is reinforced, the anchor will separate and the corridor will compress at the tertiary section. How long do I have? I ran the propagation rate. At current fracture speed, approximately 90 minutes before separation. Can I slow the fracture? I had not considered this question. The fracture was a physical stress event in a quantum resonance coupling, not a process that my training described as interruptible at the fracture site itself. Not something you addressed from inside the field by applying a portable calibration rig to a structural failure in progress. I built the numbers as fast as I could build them. The recycled air smelled of nothing unusual. The monitoring system was producing a steady, unhelpful alert tone that I turned down because it was not adding information and was adding noise. Outside the viewport, the cascade held its position on the far side of the corridor, and, in the tertiary section, the fracture propagated millimeter by millimeter toward the anchor mount. The coupling stress is being driven by resonance interference from the adjacent field layer, I said, as the calculation completed. If the resonance frequency in the adjacent layer is adjusted manually at the node interface, the interference pattern would shift. The fracture rate would slow. Possibly stop. I paused. The adjacent layer is the active field. Adjusting the resonance frequency of an active coherence field from inside the field is inadvisable, Reeves said. That was not the word I was going to use. What word were you going to use? I reviewed my word choice options. I was going to say extremely dangerous. Right, she said. But, possible. There was a word in the Karathi analytical lexicon Runseth that described the moment a calculation produces a result that is technically correct and practically catastrophic simultaneously. Every analyst used it. I had used it in reports 14 times in my career. Technically, I said. Walk me through it. I walked her through it. I am not going to reproduce the technical content of that communication in full. It is in the record, it is correct, it is complete, but I want to note, for the purpose of this account, what it felt like from my side of the communication channel, which was this: I was telling someone how to do something I had assessed as extremely dangerous, with precision, as completely as I could, as fast as I could, without hedging, without the kind of qualification-dense language that Karathi analytical training builds into every high-risk instruction. I was telling her exactly how to do the thing and trusting her to do it. I had not done this before with anyone in 11 years. She listened. She asked 3 questions. The third question was one I had not anticipated, about the resonance harmonic interaction in a specific frequency band, and the answer to it was something I had to calculate in real time, and that, when I gave it to her, made her say, "Okay, that's the piece I needed," in a tone that meant she had been building the same model I was building and had needed the one piece she did not yet have to complete it. We had been building the same model from different starting points, with different tools, in different ways. And it had been the same model. She adjusted the resonance frequency of the active coherence field from inside the active coherence field, which is the kind of sentence that does not survive well in formal technical reports because it does not have a protocol number, which is itself evidence of how unprecedented it was. The fracture slowed. At 8 minutes into the procedure, the fracture stopped. The stress on the anchor coupling was still elevated. It was not propagating anymore, but the coupling was damaged, and the damage would recur unless the anchor extension went up in time to redistribute the load. In the secondary hull, I could hear Maddox's construction team working. Cutting tools, compressed commands, the sounds of people moving fast because the margin was visible and real. It stopped, Reeves said. Yes, I said. A pause. The beacon at node 9 did not move. That's good, she said, in a tone that was, I had learned, over 50 days, to read the tones, not the tone of someone experiencing relief. It was the tone of someone who has done the immediate thing and is already assessing the next immediate thing. Not triumphant. Not frightened. Just present, here, moving. The coupling will require reinforcement before the next stress cycle, I said. Maddox's team is on the anchor extension. I know, she said. I'm going to hold here until they're done. In case something else decides to be interesting. She stayed at node 9 for 4 more hours, while Maddox's team completed the anchor extension and the coupling stress dropped back inside the rated threshold and the fracture site sealed under the redistributed load. She stayed because there was a possibility, small, quantifiable, my models put it at 11%, that the fracture had propagated far enough to compromise a secondary coupling that was outside the immediate damage zone and that would not be detectable until the next stress event. She stayed because 11% is not 0. I stayed at my console. This was not unusual. I had been spending more time at my console than the duty schedule required since the first day of the human delegation's presence. Sleep cycles had been shorter. The document labeled things that do not fit had been growing. At the 3rd hour of Reeves's vigil at node 9, Ferreira came into the observation bay with a data tablet and sat down at the secondary console without asking whether that was acceptable. I did not tell her it was not acceptable. She had been at secondary consoles all over the ship without asking for 50 days. It had ceased to be unusual. The anchor extension is going to hold, she said, in the tone of someone reporting a conclusion rather than a projection. She had a way of speaking about engineering outcomes that was different from my way of speaking about analytical outcomes, where I quantified confidence levels. She stated conclusions, and when I had first noticed this I had found it imprecise and had since revised my assessment to different kind of precision, calibrated to different variables than the ones I used. The probability assessment gives it a 91%, I began. It's going to hold, she said again, not dismissively but with finality, and looked at the display of Reeves's beacon at node 9, and her face did the thing that Maddox's face had done 14 days ago, at the viewport with the cooling coffee. The expression that the behavioral database did not have an adequate entry for. The expression of someone carrying something heavy, and choosing to keep carrying it. She always does this, Ferreira said. Not to me, precisely. In my direction, but to the room. Finds the thing that could still go wrong and parks herself next to it. It is, I said, carefully, a tactically defensible position. Ferreira looked at me. Her expression shifted into something that I had catalogued earlier in the mission as amusement but that I now recognized was more specific than that. It was the expression of someone encountering something they find genuinely surprising. That's the nicest thing anyone has ever said about Reeves's catastrophizing. I did not intend to be, I know, she said. That's why it's funny. She looked back at the display. She's going to be fine. She just needs to know the thing she can't control is as controlled as it can be, and then she'll let go. I looked at Node 9. I looked at the coupling stress readings, which were steady, declining fractionally as the anchor extension load distribution took effect. I looked at the fracture site, which was sealed. I looked at the beacon that was not moving. I had a theory about Reeves that I had been developing since the first day, since the briefing where she read my variance note and asked about Sector 7 and repaired her jacket with a needle and thread. I had refined it across 50 days of observation and 3 cycles of crisis. The theory had started as an analytical question: what drives this behavior? What is the adaptive function? What is the predictive model? And had somewhere in the last 2 weeks stopped being primarily a question. It had become something I did not have an adequate analytical term for. The theory was this: Reeves did not behave as if outcomes were inevitable. Not as a philosophical principle. Not as a conscious strategy. She behaved that way the way a structure behaves, load-bearing, not because it decided to be, but because that is what it is. Every situation she encountered as a problem that had not yet been solved, not a problem whose solution was already determined by the available resources. The probability matrix, to Reeves, was not a prediction. It was a starting position. I had built probability matrices for 11 years. I had never thought of them as starting positions. The anchor extension completed at the 4th hour. The coupling stress dropped to 60% of rated threshold. The secondary coupling that had been at 11% risk showed no fracture propagation. The corridor held. The probability matrix updated, 67% favorable, 3 points above where it had been before the fracture, because Maddox's team had extended the anchor framework further than the original design had specified, taking advantage of the emergency deployment window to add coverage they had been waiting for resources to build. They had used the crisis to gain ground. I noted this. I added it to things that do not fit, which at that point was 37 pages long and was no longer, I had accepted, a document I was going to be able to file anywhere in the standard analytical archive system. It did not fit the available categories. I was going to need to build a new category. I was starting to suspect the new category was going to require a new language. Reeves came back through the docking ring at the 5th hour. I was still at my console. Maddox had come to the observation bay at some point during the 4th hour and was standing at the viewport with his coffee, a fresh cup, not room temperature, and Ferreira had not left, which I had stopped considering remarkable. Reeves came through the door, suit half off, carrying the helmet under one arm and the portable calibration rig in the other hand, and said, "Node 9 secondary coupling is fine. I want someone to do a formal check in the next duty cycle anyway, but it's fine." She put the calibration rig on the console nearest to the door. She looked at the display, at the corridor holding, at the probability matrix showing 67. "Nice work on the anchor extension," she said to Maddox. "Ferreira designed it," Maddox said. "I know." "Nice work on the anchor extension," she said to Ferreira. Ferreira looked at her tablet. "The eastern section needs the same treatment. I already have a draft. Send it to me." Reeves picked up the calibration rig again, presumably to take it to storage, then stopped and looked at me. "You talked me through the resonance adjustment." "Yes. Good call on the interference pattern." She said this the way she said everything, not as a compliment, not as performance, just as an accurate statement about a useful piece of information at a useful time. I had most of it. I didn't have the frequency band interaction. "You were building the same model," I said. "I had one variable you did not." She nodded. The human nod, which still unsettled me slightly, which I had stopped trying to not be unsettled by. "Yeah. That's how it works, usually." She went out through the door with the calibration rig. Maddox looked at the display for a moment. Then, he said, without looking at me, she's going to sleep for about 4 hours and, then, she's going to be at the Eastern Section planning session. I looked at the display. 67%. The corridor, holding. I know, I said. I did not know when I had started knowing things like that. At some point in the last 50 days, the Karathi pattern recognition that I had spent 11 years training on probability matrices and expansion coefficients and calibration variance data had quietly, without my fully registering it, also started training on different patterns. Human patterns. The specific rhythms of how Reeves worked and how Maddox worked and how Ferreira worked and how the three of them worked together and separately and in combinations, and how those patterns intersected with crisis, and how they came apart and reformed, and what the tells were for each phase. It was the most useful thing I had ever learned that I had never decided to learn. I recognized, a different analyst than I had been 50 days ago. Not better, exactly better was a simple word for a thing that was not simple. Different. Wider. Built on a foundation that now included things it had not included before, things that did not fit the standard categories and that I had been filing in a 37-page document under a title I was going to need to change because it no longer accurately described what the document was. It was not things that do not fit. Not anymore. It was things I did not have the right model for. Yet. The corridor held. The Eastern Section anchor extension went up on schedule. The probability matrix updated again, 71. The Council authorized the additional species resource commitments, which came in 2 rotations ahead of the projected timeline. The matrix updated, 78. Ferreira's stabilization cascade, the technical name for the process of using each newly stabilized corridor section as an anchor point for the next expansion, the way a line of stitches each secures the next, began in the secondary network section and performed within the optimistic bounds of its probability range, which was a thing that happened, in my experience, approximately 20% of the time. On the 93rd day, the corridor reached the primary expansion boundary. On the 102nd day, the cascade front registered propagation velocity of 0 across the full network extent. I ran the calculation 4 times. The number did not change. I did not write a formal assessment that night. I had been writing formal assessments for 93 days and they were accurate and complete and they would not have said what I wanted to say anyway, which was not a thing I had ever had occasion to want to say before, which was, I was wrong. Not about the mathematics. The mathematics had always been correct. About what the mathematics was for. 11 years of probability matrices, and I had been using them as conclusions. Reeves used them as coordinates. Here is where you are. Here is what you are working with. Now, what are you going to do? That was not a thing I had learned in any training module or analytical course or field rotation. It was not, as near as I could tell, something that could be taught in those formats. It was something you learned by watching a person repair their jacket with a needle and thread while you were trying to explain the end of the world to them, and watching them look up and ask, "What's in Sector 7?" The formal presentation to the full council happened on the 110th day. Reeves presented alongside me, or rather, I presented the technical data and analysis and Reeves stood at the edge of the display and answered questions about methodology in the particular way she answered questions, which was, completely, simply, with no interest in whether the answer made her sound competent. She did not perform confidence. She had not performed confidence once in 110 days, and this was, I had come to understand, not modesty. It was that confidence as performance had no function she could see a use for. The situation was what it was. The data said what it said. Performing anything about it changed none of those facts. The council approved the full network expansion. Every species in the secondary wave zone. Full resource commitment. The probability of total cascade containment within 400 rotations was, as of that morning's matrix update, 83%. 83. 0 to 83. Afterwards, in the corridor outside the council chamber, which smelled of the particular formalication compounds that Karathi atmospheric conditioning uses for diplomatic events, sharpened, floral and slightly chemical, nothing like the recycled air of the Seth Marin, Reeves stopped walking and stood still for a moment. Just stood. looking at nothing in particular. One of the viewport panels, maybe, showing the station exterior and the dark beyond it and the distant shimmer of the cascade front, still there, still moving, but no longer uncontested. I stopped walking too. 83%, I said. Yeah. She looked at the viewport. Not triumphantly. Not with the expression I would have expected from the completion of something that had started as impossible, that had moved through inadvisable, that had arrived at 83. The expression was something quieter than any of those. What do you think the holdout 17 is? Engineering variance in the outer network sections, I said. Resource delivery consistency from the newer commitments. Second and third order resonance effects that the models can't fully account for until the network is fully extended. She nodded. That's what I thought too. She was quiet for a moment. The models are better than they were 100 days ago. Yes. In 100 more days they'll be better again. Yes. She looked at the viewport. The dark, the shimmer, the distance. Then, she said, in the tone that was just stating an accurate fact, 17% is still a lot of people. I said nothing. She was right. It was a lot of people. 83 was not 100. 17 was not 0. The mathematics were honest about this. We're not done, she said. No. Okay. She started walking again. I need to review Ferreira's outer section schematic. She sent me a draft last night and I think there's an anchor spacing issue in the tertiary cluster. I want to check it before the next deployment brief. She turned the corner and was gone. I stood at the viewport for a while. The station corridors were busy post-council traffic, the particular productive noise of a decision just made, the sound of 110 days of work beginning its next phase. I opened the document on my datapad. 37 pages, not titled things that do not fit anymore. Titled, as of a week ago, something that had taken me a while to find the right words for, and that I still was not fully satisfied with, but that was closer than anything else I had managed, notes on a model I am still building. I added a line, the probability matrix is not a conclusion. I did not know this when I started. I know it now. The gap between those two sentences is 110 days, 3 crises, 1 impossible corridor, and a human named Reeves who fixed a torn seam in her jacket during a briefing about the end of things and wanted to know what was in Sector 7. I paused. Then, I added, I am going to be worse at making clean predictions from now on. Then, after a moment, I think this is not a loss. The corridor held. Out there, in the dark beyond the viewport, 317 relay nodes shimmered against the cascade front, and Maddox's anchor extensions held their positions, and Ferreira's eastern section stitching was stable, and the thing that had consumed the Pulhari cluster and the Yenick belt and the inhabited systems of the Drethian expanse had met a boundary it could not cross, built from debris and improvisation and a 0.003% deviation in a briefing I had almost not finished, and it was holding. My dorsal scales had been doing the thing I did not have a cultural term for with increasing frequency for the last 100 days. I had looked it up in the behavioral index several times. It was not there. I had considered adding it, with a definition, as a formal contribution to the index. I had written the definition 3 times and deleted it 3 times because the definition kept coming out wrong, kept being too small for the thing it was describing. The closest I had come was this: the chromatic pattern produced when a Karathi analyst's models are working correctly for the wrong reasons, and this is not a problem but a discovery, and the discovery changes what the models are for. I would keep working on the definition. I had, it turned out, time. 17%. We were not done. I closed the document and went to find the outer section schematic, because Reeves was right about the anchor spacing and I had already run a preliminary check and there was a correction that needed making before the deployment brief, and the deployment brief was in 4 hours, and the window was not infinite. It never was. But it was there.